Hello world! Welcome to Learning Java, one byte at a time. This is video 22 in a tutorial series geared at bringing the wonderful wide world of Java to those with little or no programming experience. In the last video we talked a little bit about error handling and how to properly use a try-catch block in order to handle exceptions that are thrown by Java. Now in this one we have quite a bit to cover. We're going to be learning about how to create, read, and write files using the File Reader and FileWriter object. And because the File Reader and FileWriter are prone to throw exceptions such as the file not found exception or the input-output exception, it's always going to be necessary to nest these objects within try-catch blocks so that when the exceptions are thrown, we're able to handle them correctly. So without further ado, let's jump into Notepad++ and get started because we have got a lot to cover here. Now in order to use FileWriter and FileReader objects, we're going to need to make a couple of imports. We're going to need to import the FileReader and the file object and the FileReader object from the Java I/O library. We're also going to need to import the exceptions that it throws, which is going to be the file not found exception and the input-output error exception. Lastly, we're going to need to import from the utility library the scanner object because that's how we're going to actually scan through the files and read them. So with that done, let's go ahead and declare our class called FileWrite. And inside the class, we will declare our main method. In the main method, we'll declare two strings. One that we're going to call file name, and we'll set that equal to the name of the file that we're going to be reading and writing from, which we'll call awesome car. And then we're also going to have a string called data that will be what we're reading and writing, and we'll just set that equal to the words blah blah blah. And now we're ready to go. So, creating a file. Within a try-catch block, we're first going to try to create a file from the file object that we're going to call myFileX, a name of our choosing, and using the new keyword, we're going to construct it from a file object, and we're going to pass through a file name that we've already declared as being awesome.car. Two things are going to happen at this point. It's either going to successfully create the file, in which case we'll print out to the console that it did so, or it won't be able to create the file, either because the file already exists or because there was some sort of input-output exception, at which point we will catch that and also print that out to the console to let the user know what's happened. So using an if statement, let's use our myFileX object and tap into a method that it inherits from the file object called createNewFile, which is in fact a Boolean value returned. It's going to be a true or false return based on whether or not it was able to create a new file. And if it did create a new file and it returns true, we'll print out to the console that it was successful in creating the new file. And we'll also append to that the name of the file using another method inherited called getName. Now if the file already exists, we'll need to print that out to the console as well to let the user know. And then finally, if it wasn't able to because of some other weird error, we will catch the input-output exception and label it as E and just print out to the console that it wasn't able to create the file. And that's nice and tidy. Alright, so if we've done everything here correctly, if we run this program, we should actually be able to see it say that it was able to create the file. So we'll go to our console and we will compile this. We have a couple of errors here. Looks like I forgot to close off my else statement. So let's close that off. And that should fix that. All right, good. Now let's go ahead and run the program. And there it is. We have successfully created a file called awesome.car. And if we search the directory, we should in fact find a file called awesome.car. Now, if we run the file again, it should not create the file. It should actually let us know that that file has already exists. So let's go ahead and run this one more time. And there we have it. File already exists. So, looks like that's working correctly so far. And that's how to create files. Now, moving forward, let's write to a file. The way that we're going to do that is going to be very similar. We're going to start with a try-catch block. We're going to create a file writer object that we're going to call writer, a name of our choosing. And using the new keyword, we're going to construct a new one from a file writer object, and we're going to pass through, again, our file name, because that's the name of the file we need to write to. So, tapping into our writer object, we're going to use a method called write and pass through what it is that we want to write, which we've already established as being a string called data. That's the words blah, blah, blah. And then finally, we're going to tap into a method called close. And it's always important to close whatever file you're reading or writing from. And if all of this went well, we will print out to the console that the write to file was successful. And we'll also, just for kicks, append to that the data that was written, like so. Now what could happen is, could have failed, so let's go ahead and catch the IO exception that might have happened. We'll call it E, and if that happens, we will print out to the system that we could not write to the file. We're also going to do something called printing to the stack trace. And so using the E, which is the name of the exception object that we've passed through, we're going to tap into a method of that object called print stack trace. And this is going to be something we can talk a little bit more about later, but it's going to be used for debugging. It's going to log a little bit of detail about the error that was passed through, so that as we go through troubleshooting, we're going to be able to identify what happened a little bit easier. Don't worry too much about that right now, just understand it's a good practice. So if we've done that correctly, if we run this again, we should not only create the file, but also get a message that the write to the file was successful, along with the data that was written. So we'll jump back in here to our console. Let's make sure that we delete the file that we've created so we don't get a file already exists error. And we will compile this one more time. All right, that looks good. And we will run it. All right, excellent. So we've created the file successfully called awesome.car, and we've successfully written to the file the data, which is known as blah, blah, blah. So far so good. So we've created a file, we've written to a file. The only thing that leaves is how to read from a file. And you'll notice a pattern here. In order to read from a file, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to start with a try-catch block. And as before, when creating the file, we're going to have to create a file object. We'll call this myFileY, just to kind of distinguish it. And using the new keyword, we're going to create a new file and pass through the file name. Now the objects that we're creating here, the file objects that we're creating, they may already exist as far as being in the directory structure of the computer, but we need to actually have a representation of that file via an object in Java in order to access the states and behaviors of that object. And so while this file has in fact already been created, the file object still needs to be created for us to use to manipulate that file. We're also going to create our scanner object. We'll call it mreader, and we'll set that equal to a new scanner object. We'll construct a new one. Now instead of using the system.in parameter that we would normally use, because now we're not scanning from the system, we're going to be scanning from the file. We're going to pass through the file object that we've created. Now we're going to write a while block. This is a conditional statement, and essentially it goes as while whatever's in these parentheses returns true, execute what's in this block over and over and over again. And then as soon as it doesn't equal true, stop executing. Now the condition we're going to pass through is that our scanner has a next line, and that's a method of the scanner, has next line. If it does have a next line, then we're going to execute what's in this block. As soon as we've reached the end of the file, it will no longer have a next line. This will prove to be false, and the while loop will break out. So let's have our data string equal to whatever our mReader is reading as being the next line. And just to make it clear, let's also print out to the console, read from file successful, and append to that the data that we've read, which should in fact be blah, blah, blah. Everything in that while block is going to be executed as long as there's a next line. As soon as there's not a next line, let's go ahead and use the scanner object to close that file, keep it nice and tidy, and then we're going to need to catch the possible exception that could happen. So let's catch a file not found exception. We'll label that as E, and if that's the case, all we do is print out to the system, print out to the console that we could not find the file. And just for good measure, we will print to the stack trace the details of that error. All right, so nice and easy. So now if we run this again, we should not only first create the file and show that the creation was successful, write to the file, show that that was successful along with the data that was written, but then we should also read from the file and show that the read was successful along with the data that was read. So let's see if we've got this right. We'll jump back into our console. First thing we do is delete the awesome.car so we can create it all over again. Let's compile this one more time. Everything looks good, and let's run it. All right, excellent. So we have a file created successfully called awesome.car. We've written to the file successfully, the data blah, 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 and we've read from the file successfully, the data blah, blah, blah. And just as before, if we look in our directory, we do have that file awesome.car. And if you were to use a text editor, in fact, let's go ahead and use a text editor to open that up. You'll see the words blah, blah, blah. So nice and easy. And that's how you read, write, and create files. So now, in the next video, we're going to go ahead and begin to create our car database class. And in that, we're going to be using the file reader and file writer object to create, read, and write car files. And that will be the essence of our database layer for our car Bluebook application. So hopefully this wasn't too confusing. Hopefully it was also entertaining. Anyway, I can't wait to see everyone back again in the next video. Thank you so much and have a beautiful night.